Good morning and welcome everyone to the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee's 29th meeting of 2020. Our first item today is consideration of 4 notifications from the Scottish Government in relation to consent to UK statutory instruments, and they are the Detergents Amendment EU Exit Regulations 2020, the Waste and Environmental Permitting Legislative Functions Amendment, etc., for EU Exit Regulations 2020, and the Chemicals, Health and Safety and Genetically Modified Organisms Change Use Amendment, etc., of EU Exit Regulations 2020, and the REACH EU Exit Regulations of 2020. Now, members will remember that there is an agreed protocol between the Scottish Government and the Parliament in relation to instruments being made by the UK Government under powers in the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018, and which relate to proposals within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Government and the Parliament have agreed a UK-wide approach to statutory instruments, for example, to avoid duplication of effort, or where only technical or minor amendments are required. To discuss these statutory instruments and some of the issues that the wider issues that they raise, we have got Scottish Government officials with us today to answer questions on the notifications, and I'd like to welcome Don McGilvary, the Deputy Director of Environmental Quality and Circular Economy Division, Ailsa Heine, the Solicitor for Environmental Protection, and Emily Freeman, Solicitor for Environmental Protections, all from the Scottish Government. I'd like to just open it up, first of all, by one of the issues that's behind a lot of these notifications is the Northern Ireland Protocol. And I'd like to ask Don McGilvary just for this summary of where we are with the Northern Ireland Protocol, because it's still something that the government, in answer to our question, said there's still issues around. Where are we on those discussions with the UK government? And what's the practical implications so far of the Northern Ireland Protocol, particularly with regard to these notifications, these statutory instruments?
Okay, so the Northern Ireland Protocol is part of the deal that the UK government did with the EU. It's therefore part of international law, and we have to implement it. In terms of these notifications, the point that's most relevant essentially is that Northern Ireland will remain part of the EU customs area and EU regulatory system. So actually what you're finding in a number of these notifications that are in front of you today is that we're having to carve out Northern Ireland from the UK regimes that were being established and put them back into the EU regulatory regime. So that is quite a complex process in a number of cases, as you will see from the notifications that are in front of you. That is the main point for the notifications that are in front of you. There are a whole set of wider issues with the Northern Ireland Protocol around how border arrangements will work at ports that serve Scotland and Northern Ireland, for example, around how we make sure that goods transiting from the Republic through Northern Ireland to Scotland and the rest of GB are managed appropriately and don't get into the UK without appropriate regulatory compliance, if I can put it that way. So those are the kind of issues that are still, still there in terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol and still being worked through with the UK government.
Okay, and in terms of these particular notifications, I mean, the government are content that they should be passed, and there's no issues. It's a case of like getting these statutory instruments agreed so that effectively, as we come towards the actual exit date, the end of the transition rather, on the 31st of December, that effectively everything around that's covered in these notifications is going to tick along whilst this protocol is still being worked out in the background whilst the common frameworks are still being worked out in the background. Is that correct?
Yeah, and what I would say is that in some cases, in a couple of cases, and I'm sure we'll come across this in the discussion, the implications of Scotland and Northern Ireland being in different customs area essentially means that there are two different regimes that some Scottish companies, for example, will have to comply with, which is not ideal, is the way I would put it to you. So if they are selling, for example, putting chemicals on the market in both Scotland and Northern Ireland, they will have to comply with two different regulatory regimes, is the implication of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is not ideal. It creates a regulatory burden in some ways for some companies, but our assessment is that what's in these amendments is the minimum required to comply with international law in terms of what the Northern Ireland Protocol says. So whilst we don't necessarily, whilst there are difficult issues with the Northern Ireland Protocol that are still subject to discussion between the governments, then as it stands, it is a part of international law, and our assessment is that these notifications do the minimum that is required to comply with international law.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to questions from Mark Ruskell.
Yeah, thanks, convener. Morning, everybody. Can I ask about the lists of hazardous waste? The regulations allow for the possibility of a UK-wide list, but potentially some divergence in Scotland and a separate Scottish list. I just wondered if you could explain the kind of circumstances whereby that separation of lists might emerge, and perhaps also a little bit about where you see bodies like Environmental Standards Scotland sitting within the decision-making structure at UK level. I mean, maybe it's too early to tell on that one, but it'd be useful to get an idea of how that wider Scottish interest is being reflected in the UK list.
Yeah, so we start with a UK list essentially as part of retained EU law. So the EU list comes across into UK law. So we're starting from a common UK list of waste. Regulators would say that there are some benefits in sticking with a UK list of waste. Waste crosses borders within the UK in some circumstances, and it can be helped. It just makes it simpler for regulators if the lists are the same or are at least fairly consistent, and it also helps with waste data and waste tracking and so on. So there are some benefits to having a UK list, and that is the starting point. Again, it's very simply a case of devolved interests. So, for example, if Scotland felt that another part of the UK was making a decision, or other parts of the UK were making decisions to change the list of waste in a way that we didn't agree with, if they, for example, were departing more and more from the EU list of waste, and Scotland, the ministers of Scotland wanted to maintain alignment with the EU, then that separate Scottish power to amend the list of waste would give us the power to balance up those factors of, the potential benefits of maintaining consistency against that desire to keep pace and maintain equivalence with EU standards. So it's that kind of scenario where I can see there being decisions to be made. On Environmental Standards Scotland, I would have to say, in amending the list of waste, I think what the notification says is that we would expect there to be a full consultation on any changes to the list of waste that will be done by statutory instruments. So there would be a normal Scottish Government consultation document, is my expectation. We would be actively engaging with SEPA, with industry, and I can imagine Environmental Standards Scotland then being one of the stakeholders that we would want to engage with directly and actively in the event that we were thinking of a consultation on changing the list of waste. So they would be an important stakeholder, but there would be a wider opportunity for everybody with an interest normal Scottish Government public consultation would be my expectation to contribute to any decision on this.
Okay, so how does the who sits on the decision-making body for the UK-wide list then? Is that shared between all of the different environment agencies, or the OEP and ESS?
So essentially the decision, if you like, the people who make the decision are the four sets of ministers. Lawyers will keep me right here, but for example, you know, if we were to make a UK amendment, it's a statutory instrument with consent. So the decision would have to be so Scottish ministers would have to consent to that change, and also then there would be a role for Parliament because it would be captured by Protocol 2 if that is agreed as well. So obviously there will be supporting structures underneath that between officials and regulators and so on to get together and try and make decisions that, you know, try and make common recommendations, if you like, to ministers. But the decision-making process is a ministerial one and a parliamentary one.
Okay. And just finally then, go back to the convener's point about the Northern Ireland Protocol. So presumably Northern Ireland will just have the European list. They'll have to stay aligned to that. And then effectively we can decide whether we want to stick with that European list, aligning ourselves essentially to Northern Ireland, or a UK list, assuming that there's any divergence between the two. Or we could do
exactly. That's sorry, I didn't mean to speak over Mr. Ruskell there. Yes, that's exactly the position.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Stuart Stevenson wanted to come in on one of those points. Stuart.
Thank you, Convener. It's just a very simple, contained point. I presume that there is an advantage in being able to act in Scotland without the rest of the UK in cases of urgency. And the reason I think of a couple of examples. For example, fish farms are essentially something that matters in Scotland, hugely. I don't even know if there are any in England, there may be. And you might need to act urgently. So it would be perfectly proper and reasonable for the Scottish ministers to have the power to act urgently, and then subsequently to persuade their colleagues in the other jurisdictions that adding something to the list that might be related to that, or perhaps to the way offshore installations work, although England has some of that as well. Is that a fair observation, Don?
Yes, and the statutory instrument provides exactly that power. So you know, that's our view, is that is necessary to respect devolved competence. There could be an issue that arises that affects Scotland that doesn't affect other parts of the UK, and where we feel we need to act independently, and the SI gives Scottish ministers that power.
Thank you. And can I move on to questions from Liz Smith?
Thank you. Good morning. I wonder if I might return to the issue of scrutiny, if that's possible, please. As you know from last week, when our committee was discussing different statutory instruments, we had a bit of a discussion about whether these related just to technical issues, or whether there was any further scope for the committee to scrutinise what would be part of the common framework. And I would just be interested in any clarity that you can provide as to when the committee, or indeed when the Parliament, will have a further opportunity to scrutinise some of the common framework that relates to environmental issues.
Yeah, so the answer is that the common frameworks are running behind where they were expected to be running. There was a hiatus of 4 or 5 months in framework development due to officials in all the administrations being focused on other issues related to COVID and the pandemic. So we're around 4 or 5 months behind where we would have liked to be, is the situation. There are only a small number of frameworks that we now expect to be completed by the end of the year, as had originally been planned, and none of the frameworks that relate to these notifications will be completed by the end of the year. What I would say is that the frameworks are now making significant progress. They've all been drafted, they're all starting the official level clearance process. And in some cases, stakeholder engagement on them will be starting imminently. The way the timetable works is that they go through a stakeholder engagement process and then a ministerial and joint ministerial clearance process and then be scrutinised by Parliament. So my best estimate of when Parliament will have the opportunity to scrutinise the frameworks is in the early part of next year in relation to the frameworks that are related to these issues.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you for that information. Do you anticipate, with the 4 to 5 months behind which I think the Cabinet Secretary referred to last week as well, that some of the negotiations have been much slower than everybody had anticipated? Do you anticipate that that time will be made up, or do we have to accept that 4 to 5 months, especially given that COVID is obviously in a second wave?
I think we can make up some of the time, but I think it will. It's quite a very structured process of official clearance, stakeholder engagement, and then ministerial and joint ministerial, and then parliamentary engagement. So there are just a lot of steps to get through. So it's. I wouldn't overpromise in terms of how much I think we can make up out of that flow.
Again, that's helpful, and thank you for your advice on that. I mean, getting back to some of the concerns that have been raised within the Finance and Constitution Committee, and also there was some interesting debate just last week when Parliament was debating the Continuity Bill. And this is really about when it's appropriate to have primary legislation as opposed to secondary legislation. Obviously, primary legislation is about policy differences, whereas also the secondary legislation is very much about technical statutory instruments like the ones that we were debating this morning. Yeah. Do you foresee that most of the policy scrutiny will have to be undertaken after Christmas?
This is on the frameworks we're talking about, or on?
Yes, it's very much on the frameworks, yeah.
So I think some of that will start with stakeholders fairly imminently. So the directly affected regulators, businesses, trade associations, NGOs. I think we'll start to have an input into that process very soon, fairly imminently in the case of some of the frameworks. But in terms of parliamentary, the formal parliamentary scrutiny, that will be after Christmas.
Great, thank you for that. Thank you.
And thank you, Liz. Can I bring in Angus MacDonald?
Okay, thank you, convener. Good morning to everyone. If I could turn to the REACH amendment. Hopefully all members of this committee are agreed that it's unfortunate that the UK government is not agreeing to a data sharing agreement with the EU. However, as we know, the Scottish Government's continuing to pursue that approach. So I have two questions. Is the UK Government still listening to the Scottish Government's argument? And what progress has been made, if any? And secondly, how are businesses responding to the current situation? Would you say they have the certainty and the comfort that's required at this stage?
So I'm going to be quite careful not to get sucked into the politics of this, convener. What I would say is that there's a common understanding at official level, I think, of the benefits of a data sharing agreement. It would simplify the whole process dramatically. both administratively for government and regulators and for industry if we could simply access the information which is in the current EU REACH database, which, as you will understand, UK companies and UK regulators have contributed to building and contributing to over the years. So as an official, I would say by far the best administrative solution here is a data sharing agreement. I think officials in the UK government would agree with that position. It's very, very difficult to get any meaningful understanding of where negotiations on that are at between the UK and EU. I sit here today and I cannot say with any certainty at all where that will end up. As with the wider trade agreement negotiations and everything else, I think the position of business would be that they would welcome early certainty on what the outcome on both the trade negotiation and the data sharing agreement in relation to chemicals are, so that they can plan appropriately. And I'm clear that the industry would be supportive of a data sharing agreement because it would dramatically reduce the regulatory burden on them in terms of transitioning to a UK regime. So that's my understanding of the position.
Okay, thanks, Convener. That's me.
Thank you, Angus. And can I come to Claudia Beamish?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to you, Don, and to everyone with you. I'd just like to tease out a little bit more about the question Angus was asking about REACH. And I wonder about, in terms of certainty for businesses, which you've highlighted already, in terms of the transitional arrangements, these are an obvious concern for businesses. Any further light on this, in view of the fact that it does appear that the Scottish Government, if I understand it correctly, has said they reluctantly accept that there won't be data sharing with the EU. But please highlight that if I've got that wrong.
So sorry, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. If I can just explain. So we remain. We remain very much of the view that data sharing agreement is the preferred solution here. We continue to make that case to the UK government. We most certainly have not given up on that being the outcome, and I do believe that is still an active discussion between the UK government and the EU, as best I understand it, although it's very unclear. What these transitional provisions do is, essentially we're having to plan for a scenario we don't want, if I can put it that way. So there's no guarantee that a data sharing agreement or a trade agreement will be signed, and so what we're having to do is to prepare for essentially what I think ministers would regard as the worst case scenario, which is no data sharing agreement, and where we have to reconstruct the whole of the REACH database within the UK regime. And there's been very strong feedback from industry that the previous transitional timetable wasn't achievable, that it had too much risk attached to it, and they pointed out, not unreasonably, that when EU REACH was brought in, it was brought in phases. And they've argued then that we should bring the data requirements for UK REACH in a kind of similar banded system. So that's essentially what the change to the arrangements here means, and it means that it's now a banded approach to bringing chemicals into the UK regime, with the highest volume, highest hazard chemicals first, medium volume, and then lower volume chemicals. But it does mean a fairly significant extension of the overall transition time. It's still shorter than the time that was taken to create the EU REACH database, but the reason for the word reluctant is that there's no doubt that timetable is something of a compromise.
Right. Thank you. It's helpful that you've clarified there is hope, but we hope that for the simplicity which the data sharing work for business and indeed for regulators and everybody else. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any other colleagues wanting to ask any questions on any of these statutory instruments. So I want to thank Don McGilvray and his team this morning for their time and for answering our questions on these issues. So thank you very much. Our next meeting in the 10th of November will consider more notifications from the Scottish Government in relation to UK statutory instruments and also an EU exit-related Scottish statutory instrument. But that concludes our meeting in public today. Thank you all.